They said Camilla's orders were absolute, no questions, no hesitation. So when she commanded the guards to burn every old box buried in the estate's storage room, no one dared to ask why. But one guard did something unthinkable. He opened a box. And the moment he saw what was inside, he froze, unable to breathe, as if the entire truth of Camilla's past was staring straight back at him. The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of the last command still lingered in the marble halls. Camilla's eyes had not wavered yet in their steel. Blue calm lay the weight of something unsaid, a secret judgment that hung heavier than any ceremonial crown. Outside, the wind stirred the trimmed hedges, but inside, the palace breathed with a different rhythm. The slow, deliberate heartbeat of obedience measured in footfalls and the faint rustle of silk across polished stone. It began in the archives, a private wing seldom traversed by any but the most trusted aides and the palace guards themselves. Here, the air was thick with the scent of parchment, aged leather, and the faint perfume of forgotten lavender sachets pressed between volumes centuries old. Dust motes drifted lazily in the slanting shafts of sunlight, glimmering like tiny suspended stars. And amid this quiet constellations of history, Camilla issued a command that rippled through the hierarchy. Burn the old boxes stored in the private archives. The guard, a figure of unquestioned loyalty but quiet curiosity, paused mid-step. He had long understood that obedience within these walls was not merely expected, it was demanded. Every gesture, every bowed head, was part of a living ritual that preserved the palace's dignity. Yet something about this command felt different. The air itself seemed to thicken, as if the very dust remembered the secrets hidden within those boxes. He hesitated. One hand rested on the hilt of ceremonial armor at his side. The other clenched the edge of a ledger he had been transporting earlier. The room was filled with a silence so absolute it felt almost accusatory, broken only by the whisper of pages fluttering under a draught from an open window high above. In that pause, he sensed the unspoken weight of history pressing down, a moral crossroads disguised as obedience. The camera drifts through the palace gates, sweeping past carved stone lions and iron portcullises, before resting on the archives themselves. Towering shelves, stacked with boxes labeled in faded ink. Some bore emblems long forgotten, others held the seals of past sovereigns. Every label seemed to murmur a warning, every seal a plea against destruction. And yet Camilla's voice had cut through the air like a blade. Burn them, she had said, her tone final, the kind that brooked no argument. Yet within the syllables lingered a subtle hesitation, a flicker of something personal, something dangerous. The guard's mind raced. To comply would be to obey the crown, but to hesitate, or worse, to disobey, was to court disgrace, suspicion, and perhaps ruin. He approached the nearest box, a rectangular container bound in thick rope. Its surface bore scratches that hinted at repeated handling over decades, maybe centuries. Dust gathered in the grooves of the carved emblem on its lid, a symbol half erased by time, yet still recognizable, a crown intertwined with an ancient crest. He knelt to inspect it more closely, his gloved fingers brushing against the rough surface. There was a subtle vibration under his touch, a hum of memory that made him pause. The archives themselves seemed to lean closer, as if the palace walls were watching, listening. A draught carried the faint scent of ink and old wax, a fragrance so pungent it almost spoke of voices long gone. Somewhere in the corner, hidden beneath a stack of rolled parchment, lay a torn letter. Its edges were frayed, its seal broken. The guard's gaze flicked to it, but he forced himself to continue his task. Every fiber of his training reminded him of his duty, the crown, the protocol, the chain of command that stretched unbroken through centuries. Yet, as he lifted the box toward the hearth where the flames would be prepared, a flicker of doubt took root. The camera follows his movement across the hall. Polished stone floors reflecting the amber glow of sunlight, tapestries swaying gently, almost as if alive. The echo of boots on marble wasn't just sound. It was discipline made audible, a rhythm that had carried generations of guards through triumph, turmoil, and tragedy. And now, that same rhythm was fractured by the weight of a single command. He opened the lid slightly, enough to peer inside. The faintest glimmer caught his eye. A hint of gilded paper, a metallic shimmer, the edge of a seal that had not yet been broken. He froze, the box trembling slightly in his grasp. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch, every second weighted with the gravity of what might lie within. The archive itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls themselves were conspiring to reveal the truth. Camilla's silhouette appeared in the doorway, framed by the grand archway and the cascade of light behind her. Her expression remained serene, almost distant, yet her eyes were sharp, picking out every movement, every hesitation. "Do not delay," she said softly, yet the words carried the same irrevocable authority as any shouted command. And still, her gaze lingered on the box he held, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a flicker of unease crossing her otherwise composed features. The guard stepped back slightly, placing the box down on the polished floor. He could feel the heat of the upcoming flames, smell the faint trace of soot from previous burns, and yet the glint of the unbroken seal called to him. He was caught between the world of duty and the universe of conscience. Every second of hesitation was a silent rebellion, every drawn breath a test of moral endurance. The palace itself seemed to respond. The soft creak of the ceiling beams above, the whisper of distant footsteps in adjoining halls, the muted click of an unseen clock marking time with mechanical precision. And within that cadence, the guard felt the invisible weight of centuries of loyalty pressing upon him. To obey was to erase history, to resist was to challenge authority. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a rustle, a shift, drew his gaze back to the box. Inside, partially hidden beneath yellowed sheets, was a document bound in red ribbon. Its edges were worn, and the seal bore the unmistakable emblem of a long, dead minister, a symbol of alliances and betrayals now forgotten. For a moment, the guard could feel the pulse of history itself, decisions made in shadowed corridors, loyalties pledged and broken, truths buried beneath velvet and ink. He knelt closer, heart quickening, and brushed away a layer of dust. The ribbon loosened under his fingers, the paper crackling faintly in protest. And though he knew it was forbidden, though the voice of protocol thundered in his mind, he could not help but lift the corner, just enough to glimpse the script within. The words were elegant, formal, but their meaning struck like a bell. Hidden alliances, confidential correspondence, actions taken that had never been recorded in official histories. For a long moment, the guard remained frozen, suspended between duty and revelation. Camilla's presence in the doorway was a silent reminder of the peril. Every action, every glance, every heartbeat here carried consequences measured not in hours, but in legacy. The box sat open, a silent invitation, its contents shimmering in the dust-filled light, teasing the guard with the forbidden knowledge that could unravel centuries of carefully maintained order. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the ornate window panes, as though the palace itself were sighing at the choices unfolding within. Dust motes caught in the sunbeams floated like fragments of time, each one a reminder that history was delicate, easily disturbed, and fiercely protected. And yet, the guard lingered. He could not tear his eyes from the partially revealed contents, nor could he silence the quiet voice of conscience whispering that not all commands were righteous, that not every act of loyalty required destruction. The decision, though unspoken, was pressing upon him with unbearable clarity, obedience or discovery, loyalty or moral truth. The shadows in the room lengthened, stretching along the walls, enveloping the boxes and their secrets. The distant echo of ceremonial bells tolled from the palace chapel, a measured rhythm that seemed to mock the irregular pulse of his own. The air grew thick with anticipation, the silence almost tangible, pressing against his chest like the weight of centuries. The guard finally drew a slow breath, his fingers brushing the edges of the document once more. He could hear the faint crackle of wood already being prepared for fire elsewhere in the hall, the low murmur of attendants setting the hearth, unaware of the moral tempest about to erupt in their midst. And as the light from the high windows played upon the gold embossing of the seals and the edges of the ribbon, a single thought anchored itself in his mind. Some truths once glimpsed could never be unseen. The camera lingers on the box, the glinting seal, and the hesitant hand poised above it. The palace, in all its grandeur and discipline, holds its breath, waiting for the inevitable choice between obedience and conscience, between the unbroken chain of protocol and the dangerous allure of hidden history. As the flames are prepared in the hearth, the guard notices a box slightly ajar, revealing a glimmer of something forbidden, a silent invitation to truth. The moment lingers, heavy with consequence, and the decision that follows will set the course for everything to come. The hearth crackled faintly, the first flames licking at dry kindling as attendants moved with precise, ceremonial steps. The guard's gaze lingered on the ajar box. Inside, faint ribbons and glimmering edges suggested documents of significance, but significance of what kind he could not yet know. Each second stretched, heavy and almost sacred, as if the palace itself measured the weight of impending choices. He hesitated, fingers hovering above the partially revealed contents. The walls seemed to close in, the tapestries whispering of past intrigue, the polished marble reflecting not only his image but the centuries of duty it represented. A single breath, slow and deliberate, passed through him, mingling with the faint scent of burning wood and old parchment. Somewhere in the silence, a faint creak of the floorboards announced the approach of Camilla's attendant. The guard replaced the lid carefully, though not before a glimmer of the first document caught the sunlight, a fragment of gilded script dancing like a silent warning. The act was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it felt monumental. Obedience and curiosity wrestled in his chest, each demanding its due. Camilla's voice, low and controlled, broke the hush. "Do not linger." The words were simple, but they carried the authority of a ruler who had never known defeat. The guard lifted the box, his arms steady but his mind turbulent. As he moved toward the hearth, he glimpsed another sealed container, partially hidden beneath a layer of dust, a small, insignificant-looking chest that pulsed with quiet importance. He knelt, inspecting it with deliberate care. The emblem engraved on its lid was intricate, a crown entwined with a serpent, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. He traced the design with a gloved fingertip, aware that every motion could carry implications he was not yet ready to face. The palace had always been a keeper of secrets, each corridor a repository of whispered truths, each artifact a testament to choices made in shadow. The room's light shifted as the sun passed behind the palace's high stone walls, casting elongated shadows that seemed to reach for the boxes, as if urging disclosure. The guard opened the chest just enough to peer inside, and the metallic scent of old ink and wax greeted him. Letters bound in faded ribbons, diaries whose leather covers had long since stiffened, and a folded map marked with cryptic symbols. All lay within, silent witnesses to the lives and loyalties of those long gone. A sudden sound startled him, A soft gasp from the corridor outside, almost too quiet to be real. He froze, listening. Nothing followed, yet the silence itself seemed charged with expectancy. Somewhere deep in the palace, history was stirring, shifting beneath the weight of his attention. He could not ignore it. He could not turn away. The first diary, its leather worn and cracked, bore the initials of a minister whose name had been long erased from public memory. The guard opened it slowly, reverently, each page a tactile bridge to another time. Script curled across the page in elegant, deliberate strokes, recording actions, alliances, and decisions that had never reached the annals of official history. Even the smallest notation seemed loaded with moral consequence. As he read, a cold certainty settled in his chest. Some commands, though lawful, were not righteous. Loyalty alone could not justify the destruction of what had been preserved for decades. He glanced toward the hearth again, the flames now beginning to lick hungrily at the prepared kindling. Each flicker reflected in his eyes, reminding him that time was short, that obedience demanded immediate action. Yet, even as he contemplated the moral weight, curiosity overpowered hesitation. He retrieved a letter tied with crimson ribbon, the wax seal unbroken but soft with age. The emblem, a crown intertwined with two crossed keys, suggested a confidence entrusted to no one living. Carefully, he lifted the seal, mindful of the potential consequences. The paper crackled faintly, like the whisper of a secret ready to emerge. Inside, the handwriting was elegant, formal, and meticulous. It chronicled meetings, decisions made in shadows, and correspondences that suggested alliances the Crown had never acknowledged publicly. His eyes widened, heart beating faster than the slow, deliberate rhythm of ceremonial duty that had guided him through years of service. The letters hinted at moral compromises, actions taken to preserve power rather than justice. The guard felt a shiver, as though the palace itself recoiled at this act of revelation. Dust swirled in the shafts of light, motes glinting like stars disturbed from their orbit. Outside, a distant clock tolled once, twice, marking the passage of moments that felt both infinite and impossibly fleeting. He knew that each second brought him closer to discovery, yet retreat was no longer an option. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a folded map, edges frayed, marked with symbols that seemed arcane but deliberate. Lines connected distant locations within the palace, corridors that were otherwise inaccessible, and rooms whose existence had been hidden from even the most senior staff. The map hinted at clandestine movement, covert communication, and the shadowed network that had supported the palace's inner workings for generations. The realization hit him. The command to burn these boxes was not mere housekeeping or ritual. It was a deliberate act to erase inconvenient truths. And now, by a single act of curiosity, he had trespassed not only against protocol, but against the carefully constructed narrative of loyalty itself. Every instinct demanded that he stop, that he obey, yet every conscience-driven impulse urged him to uncover more. The hearth now blazed, flames dancing and reflecting on the polished marble floor. The boxes trembled slightly under his careful handling, as if anticipating the fate that Camilla's command had decreed. He could almost hear the whispers of history, warnings, entreaties, accusations embedded in the paper, alive and resonant in the hush of the hall. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the room as he handled the chest, a reminder that even inanimate objects could carry echoes of consequence. The guard's mind raced, balancing the moral weight of discovery against the dangers of exposure. One small misstep, one caught glance, and everything could unravel. The palace, its order, and his own future. He straightened, chest tight, fingers brushing the edges of the documents once more. A decision had begun to crystallize, Some truths were too important to destroy, too vital to conceal. Even at the cost of personal risk, the preservation of history, of morality, had begun to outweigh obedience. At that moment, Camilla reappeared in the doorway, her presence a quiet demand for attention. She regarded him silently, eyes scanning the hearth, the boxes, the faint glimmer of exposed secrets. There was no accusation in her gaze, only the weight of expectation. And yet, in that pause, the guard recognized a truth. The order, while absolute, had been given with knowledge of its danger. The crown, it seemed, had its own unspoken reasons. The guard made his choice quietly, almost imperceptibly. One letter, delicate and unassuming, he tucked into his uniform beneath the ceremonial sash. His hand lingered only a moment longer than necessary before replacing the chest lid with meticulous care. To the casual observer, the act appeared to be nothing more than obedience, a fulfillment of protocol. Yet beneath the surface, the first crack in the chain of loyalty had appeared. The camera lingers on the hearth as flames begin to consume the first few boxes, the fire reflecting in the guard's determined eyes. Dust swirled in the air, catching the light, each particle a suspended moment in history. Outside the windows, the day waned, shadows stretching across corridors that had seen centuries of secrecy, and now, inevitably, would witness the unfolding consequences of curiosity and conscience colliding. The palace seemed to exhale, the silence shifting from tension to expectation. The guard stepped back, hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid yet internally, the first tremors of moral reckoning stirred. He had obeyed, yet in doing so, he had preserved the potential for truth, a paradox that hung between protocol and conscience, between duty and morality. Every element in the room, the crackle of fire, the scent of burning wood, the glimmer of ancient seals, the soft echo of distant footsteps, spoke of balance precariously maintained. And in that fragile equilibrium, the guard understood something essential. The palace, in all its grandeur, was more than stone and silk. It was a living chronicle of human choice, of secrecy, of power wielded with careful discretion. The chapter closes on a single heavy moment. The box ajar, the glimmering seal, the hidden letter safely stowed, and the guard standing at the threshold of decision. The tension is palpable, the consequences invisible but immense, and the first act of defiance, quiet yet irreversible, has set the stage for revelations yet to come. As the flames consume the other boxes, the hidden letter remains a silent witness to a secret preserved. The guard's choice has quietly defied protocol, and what he discovers next will ignite a chain of events that could unravel loyalty itself. The guard left the hearth behind, yet the heat of the flames lingered on his skin, a subtle reminder that destruction had begun without him. Outside the immediate hall, the palace corridors stretched like a labyrinth of memory and authority, their polished stones reflecting the waning sunlight. Every step echoed softly, a quiet percussion that contrasted with the fire's crackle. Yet both sounds carried a weight heavier than mere acoustics, a weight of history, of decisions, of loyalties tested. The letter hidden beneath his ceremonial sash pressed lightly against his chest. Its presence was almost imperceptible, yet it radiated significance. He walked deliberately, careful to maintain the rhythm of a guard fulfilling protocol, even as curiosity began to swell in his mind. Each corridor he passed held portraits of long, dead sovereigns, their painted eyes sharp and unwavering, as if silently judging every motion, every choice. He entered a smaller antechamber, a room seldom touched by others, lined with bookshelves that reached toward a vaulted ceiling. Dust had settled in layers here, thick and soft, hiding the edges of countless manuscripts. The air smelled faintly of old leather, beeswax polish, and the subtle tang of iron from the window latches. Light from a high window cast long, diagonal beams, illuminating the dust motes like drifting constellations, their motion slow and hypnotic. Kneeling, he retrieved a small chest from the shadows. Unlike the boxes already destined for fire, this one was compact, unassuming, and tightly sealed with a ribbon bearing the intertwined keys he had glimpsed earlier. His hands, gloved but steady, traced the emblem lightly. Even in its simplicity, the chest emanated a quiet insistence. "Open me and remember." The first lift of the lid revealed a cascade of letters, neatly stacked yet fragile with age. Their envelopes were bound with ribbons of muted crimson and gold, each bearing seals long unbroken. A map, folded and fragile, peeked from the corner, marked with lines, symbols, and notations that suggested clandestine routes through the palace and neighboring estates. The guard exhaled softly, a mixture of awe and apprehension. These were not mere documents. They were a whispering of past lives, alliances, and choices hidden from public record. He selected a letter at random, easing it out with extreme care. The wax seal cracked faintly under his touch, releasing a subtle scent of beeswax and thyme. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting, elegant and deliberate, chronicled conversations and arrangements between figures long erased from history. Every line seemed imbued with moral weight, promises made in secrecy, favors exchanged for loyalty rather than justice, actions recorded yet never acknowledged. The guard's pulse quickened, yet he moved with deliberate calm. Protocol demanded his outward composure, and he obeyed that demand with precision. But internally, the weight of what he was reading pressed upon him with a force that rivaled any formal command he had ever received. The palace, in all its meticulous order, had become a stage for hidden narratives, and he had stepped squarely into the wings. A map lay beneath the letters, faintly inked, edges worn from repeated folding. The notations were cryptic, a series of symbols connecting rooms, hidden corridors, and chambers otherwise inaccessible to even senior staff. Each line suggested movement not recorded in the palace logs, couriers carrying messages unseen, confidential meetings, secret negotiations. The guard traced the lines with a fingertip, imagining the whispers, the silent steps, the careful choreography of history unfolding in shadow. Hours seemed to pass in the slow light, though perhaps it was only minutes. He opened another letter, its wax seal bearing the insignia of a minister whose name had been carefully removed from official records. The contents revealed carefully hidden alliances, the consequences of which had been borne silently for decades. Some choices had been morally ambiguous, others daringly subversive, yet all were carried out under the guise of loyalty to the crown. The guard leaned back against the polished shelves, the faint echo of footsteps from a distant corridor reminding him of the discipline he was trained to uphold. Still, curiosity pulled him forward, insistent and quiet. He retrieved a diary bound in dark, worn leather. Its pages were brittle, yet each contained meticulous entries documenting the private lives of palace figures, their decisions, and the silent moral compromises made in the corridors of power. Reading, he felt the pulse of history as if it were alive, a rhythm beneath the palace's stone floor. Some entries detailed ceremonial logistics, the movement of dignitaries and their entourages. Others revealed personal negotiations, favors exchanged, promises broken, alliances forged in secrecy. Every word carried weight, every revelation pressed against the thin veneer of order that the palace maintained so carefully. A draught whispered through the antechamber, stirring the ribbons binding the letters and shifting the dust on the floor. It was a gentle sound, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the faint scent of the fire left behind in the main hall. The guard paused, realizing that he had become part of a quiet conspiracy, not of action, but of understanding. Knowledge, he now sensed, was itself a force capable of challenging authority. He opened a small envelope, finding a letter addressed to Camilla herself, though clearly written decades prior. The handwriting was formal, deliberate, each sentence a careful negotiation of loyalty and morality. Some phrases hinted at compromise, others at secret misjudgments, yet all were couched in the rhetoric of honor. The guard's mind raced. Could Camilla have been guarding secrets as morally complex as those contained in these letters? The thought lingered, unsettling yet compelling. The palace seemed to respond to his intrusion. Shadows deepened along the high ceilings, and the light shifted in ways that made familiar corners appear alien. A faint creak of a floorboard reminded him that every movement was observed, even when unseen. Yet he could not turn away. Each letter, each diary, each folded map was a thread, and the tapestry of history demanded to be seen, even at the cost of personal risk. He selected another letter, one small and unassuming, its seal unbroken. Breaking it, he discovered not only correspondence but instructions, subtle and carefully worded, indicating covert alliances between the crown and figures whose loyalty had been taken for granted. Some instructions suggested morally dubious actions undertaken to maintain stability, while others hinted at long, forgotten favors that had shaped policy and palace life. The weight of hidden histories pressed upon him, and yet he read on. The guard's conscience wrestled with protocol. Every fiber of his training demanded that he obey, that he maintain order, that he allow the flames in the main hall to consume what had been commanded. Yet every instinct urged him to preserve what he had uncovered. Here, in the quiet shadows of the palace archives, the tension between duty and conscience became palpable, almost a physical presence pressing against his chest. The camera pans across the room, the sunlight catching on dust-laden shelves, illuminating spines of books with gilded titles long unread, the faint glint of sealed letters in the corner, the map splayed across the desk, lines and symbols stretching like veins of hidden knowledge. It is a room alive with history, every object a testament to choices made, secrets kept, and morality deferred in service of power. As he leafed through yet another diary, the guard discovered references to ceremonial ranks and duties, the intricate hierarchy that had governed the palace for centuries. Each entry, though meticulous in tone, carried subtle indications of political maneuvering and ethical compromise. He began to understand that loyalty here was not absolute. It was negotiated, interpreted, and often hidden beneath layers of protocol and expectation. The weight of discovery pressed down. One misstep could be catastrophic. The wrong glance, the wrong word, and centuries of order could unravel. Yet in these moments, the guard felt a strange exhilaration, a moral awakening that had been denied to him in the routine discipline of palace life. History, he realized, was not static, it was alive, and he had been given access to its pulse. The guard paused, fingers resting lightly on the folded map. He traced one line to a corridor he had never walked, a chamber he had never entered. Each symbol represented a story untold, a secret preserved, a choice made in shadow. The realization deepened. The palace itself was not merely a building, but a living chronicle of human ambition, morality, and compromise. And now he was entwined with that chronicle, a participant in the quiet rebellion of knowledge. In that moment, he understood the enormity of his first act of defiance. The hidden letter tucked beneath his sash was not merely a preserved document. It was a spark capable of igniting questions, challenging authority, and reshaping the palace's understanding of itself. Knowledge was no longer passive. It was a force, delicate yet powerful, and the guard felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily upon his shoulders. Hours passed as he catalogued, read, and considered. The palace outside the window shifted with the fading light, shadows stretching across corridors, halls, and stairways that had witnessed centuries of silent history. Every sound, the faint shuffle of a distant servant, the low murmur of the wind against stone, reminded him that discovery was dangerous, yet necessary. He had crossed an invisible line, and the repercussions would ripple outward in ways he could scarcely predict. The guard's discovery triggers a small breach of protocol. He keeps one letter hidden, setting the stage for an inevitable confrontation. In the stillness of the archives, the palace itself seems to wait, aware that the first threads of hidden truths have begun to unravel. The palace seemed unusually quiet, yet the silence was deceptive. Each footfall of the guard echoed like a drumbeat of conscience, a reminder that he had crossed a threshold from obedience into knowledge. The hidden letter beneath his sash pressed lightly against his chest, a silent, tangible weight of responsibility that had no parallel in his years of disciplined service. He returned to the small antechamber, chest still in hand, and placed the folded map atop the desk. Its lines connected corridors, chambers, and passageways with a precision that suggested premeditated secrecy. Some paths led to rooms he had never entered, others intersected beneath floors he had thought empty. The palace had become a labyrinth not just of stone, but of history, memory, and concealed truths. Opening a diary carefully, he traced the pages with gloved fingers. The entries were meticulous, elegant, and deeply intimate. Records of ceremonial obligations, personal promises, and delicate negotiations conducted entirely out of public view. Some passages referenced alliances with figures whose existence had long been omitted from official histories. Others hinted at morally ambiguous choices made in the service of the crown. The guard's mind raced. Every word was a challenge, a question, a subtle accusation. He paused at one entry, the ink faded but legible. It spoke of a meeting in a hidden chamber, where the crown's advisors had deliberated on matters of morality and power. The guard's eyes lingered over the description. Favors traded, compromises made, and secrets agreed upon in silence. The words carried the weight of centuries, and he felt the faint pulse of history beneath his fingertips. These were not merely letters. They were living echoes, capable of reshaping understanding, of redefining loyalty. A faint creak from the corridor reminded him of the ever-present eyes of palace hierarchy. Protocol demanded vigilance. Curiosity demanded inquiry. The tension was almost unbearable, a quiet battle between the reflexes of trained obedience and the rising moral imperative to preserve what should not be destroyed. The guard's hand lingered on another envelope, unassuming in its appearance, but alive with promise. Inside, he found correspondence addressed to Camilla herself, though centuries old. The handwriting was formal, deliberate, and weighted with meaning. Some lines hinted at compromises she may have inherited. Others suggested actions taken to protect the crown's reputation at a cost to morality. The guard's pulse quickened. Could the queen, in her present authority, be guarding secrets as ethically complex as those he now held in his hands? The thought lingered, unsettling yet impossible to dismiss. The map beneath the letters was a revelation. Faint ink lines connected rooms not referenced in any official palace guide. Hidden corridors wound beneath the marble floors. Secret stairways allowed silent passage, and marked chambers hinted at alliances and gatherings that had never been acknowledged. Each line suggested a choreography of discretion spanning decades, a quiet ballet of loyalty and secrecy performed in shadows. As he absorbed the implications, the guard realized the enormity of what he held, knowledge capable of undermining the carefully constructed narrative of obedience. The palace itself had been built as a repository of power, but hidden beneath its polished surfaces were truths that challenged not just the crown, but the ethical foundation of its rule. He understood that loyalty alone could no longer dictate action. Conscience had to intervene. The camera moves slowly through the antechamber, catching the glint of gold on a ribbon, the delicate curvature of script on a yellowed page, the faint shimmer of dust disturbed by a gloved hand. Sunlight catches the folds of the map, illuminating lines and symbols as if revealing the palace's hidden veins. Every object in the room becomes a character, a witness, a custodian of moral complexity. The guard opened another diary, its leather stiff and cracked with age. Inside were notes of ceremonial practice, intertwined with reflections on difficult decisions made in private. Names had been removed, yet the context suggested betrayals and favors, promises upheld and promises broken, all under the guise of propriety. Each page seemed to whisper that power had always been entwined with ethical compromise, and that silence had preserved authority at a cost. He lingered over a passage describing the preparation of documents for ceremonial review, but beneath the procedural description lay a moral tension, a subtle narrative of what had been concealed. Some actions, though legal within palace protocol, had skirted ethical boundaries. The realization was a quiet shock. The palace, magnificent and disciplined as it appeared, had always been a stage for moral negotiation. A sudden draft stirred the ribbons binding the letters. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, yet it reminded the guard of the delicate balance of secrecy. He placed one diary carefully back into the chest, preserving its contents, then retrieved another letter, folding it with equal care. His movements were precise, ritualized, yet internally, tension simmered like molten metal under marble floors. Hours passed in careful observation. The guard catalogued, examined, and absorbed the implications of every letter, every map, every diary. Outside the high windows, sunlight faded into a soft evening glow, elongating shadows along corridors and across shelves that had witnessed centuries of secrecy. Every sound, the rustle of pages, the faint creak of floorboards, the distant murmur of staff, served as a reminder of the constant balance between obedience and discovery. The moral tension deepened. He understood that by preserving a single letter beneath his sash, he had already violated protocol. Every instinct screamed caution, every ethical impulse urged preservation. The act was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it was monumental. The palace's meticulously maintained order had been nudged, quietly but irreversibly, by a single deliberate choice. He paused before another chest, smaller, nondescript, yet clearly significant. The emblem engraved on its lid was faint, a crown intertwined with a serpent, a symbol of wisdom, danger, and vigilance. His fingers traced the emblem lightly, aware that each motion, each decision was recorded not in writing, but in the invisible ledger of conscience. The palace seemed to hold its breath. The chest opened with a soft creak, revealing a bundle of letters tied in faded ribbon. Each was addressed to figures now long dead, chronicling actions and decisions concealed from public record. Some spoke of alliances that had safeguarded power but compromised morality. Others hinted at betrayals that had gone unnoticed yet shaped palace history. The guard's pulse quickened. Each letter was a thread, and he had begun to weave them into a tapestry of understanding that was forbidden yet irresistible. One letter, in particular, caught his eye. It was small, unassuming, and addressed to no one living. The wax seal was faintly impressed with a crest half, erased by time. Carefully he broke the seal, revealing a delicate script chronicling decisions that had been deliberately hidden. The choices recorded within were morally ambiguous. Decisions made for stability yet fraught with ethical compromise. The words struck him. Loyalty could no longer be blind. Conscience demanded acknowledgement. He lingered, reading line after line until the chamber seemed to fade around him. The marble walls, the polished floors, the sunlit dust, all became a backdrop to the unfolding revelations. The palace, magnificent in order and discipline, was also a vessel of concealed truths, and he had become both witness and custodian. Every fiber of his training pressed upon him: maintain composure, preserve protocol, follow the chain of command. Yet now, obedience alone was insufficient. The camera pans across the floor, the maps splayed out, letters scattered with ritual care, diaries stacked neatly but fully open to reveal their contents. Dust motes drift lazily in beams of fading sunlight, each one a suspended testament to history, each one catching the eye as though urging recognition. The guard's gloved hand hovers over another document, his choice deliberate and careful. He places the final diary back into the chest, closes the lid, and secures the ribbons. Yet one letter remains hidden beneath his sash, a conscious act of defiance, a commitment to conscience over protocol. The palace, in all its grandeur and discipline, remains unaware of the subtle fracture, yet the seed has been planted. Knowledge preserved, history protected, morality quietly asserted. The evening shadows deepen across corridors, stretching along the walls as though reaching for the secrets now glimpsed. Outside, distant bells toll, marking time with unrelenting regularity. Inside, the guard remains poised, a silent participant in the palace's hidden narrative. He has crossed the threshold from observer to custodian, and the consequences of his choice, though invisible, are inevitable. The guard's decision to preserve a single letter quietly breaches protocol. What he has discovered and chosen to keep sets in motion a chain of events that will confront loyalty with conscience. The palace itself seems to wait, anticipating the first confrontation between hidden truth and ceremonial authority. The echo of footsteps traveled like a warning through the stone corridors, bouncing off vaulted ceilings and ornate archways. The guard's pace was deliberate, yet his mind raced ahead, mapping the invisible lines of consequence drawn by his previous actions. A single letter, hidden beneath his ceremonial sash, pressed against him like a living reminder that loyalty and conscience were no longer aligned. The palace, in all its disciplined splendor, felt suddenly unfamiliar, its shadows elongated, its corridors whispering of unseen witnesses. Outside, the fading sun cast golden beams through stained glass, splintering into fractured patterns on polished marble. Portraits of long, dead sovereigns watched silently, eyes sharp and accusatory, their painted gazes seeming to track the guard's every step. Each corridor he passed seemed imbued with the memory of whispered conversations, hushed deliberations, and decisions made under the weight of centuries of expectation. He felt the presence of history around him, and with it, the quiet urgency of a reckoning long deferred. Meanwhile, in the grand hall itself, Camilla waited, her figure framed by towering columns and the warm glow of candlelight. Her posture was poised, regal, yet a subtle tension betrayed a mind alert to disruption. The palace had endured centuries of ceremonial procedure, of unquestioned obedience, but Camilla's intuition told her that something had shifted. Orders, though precise and deliberate, could be ignored, manipulated, or most dangerously, preserved. The thought alone tightened her chest. The guard entered the hall. The polished floors reflected the flickering light of chandeliers suspended high above, their crystals casting refracted rainbows across gilded moldings and marble columns. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Each step felt like a measured chord in a symphony of authority and suspense. Camilla's gaze settled on him immediately, sharp and deliberate, a silent query for compliance. "You've returned," she said softly, yet the words carried a weight heavier than any shouted command. The guard inclined his head, maintaining the discipline he had been trained to embody, but internally, tension coursed through him like a river against its banks. All boxes prepared for the fire, she asked, her voice deceptively calm, a careful probe beneath which the current of suspicion ran strong. "Yes, Your Majesty," he replied, tone steady, though his hands pressed lightly against the hidden letter. Every syllable was measured, yet every heartbeat seemed loud enough to betray him. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken tension, a duel played out without swords or force, only protocol and conscience. Camilla stepped forward, the hem of her ceremonial gown brushing the floor, the soft swish echoing faintly against the hall's stone walls. And the archives, her voice carried no accusation, only inquiry, but her eyes, sharp and unwavering, implied far more. The guard straightened, aware that every gesture was under scrutiny. "They have been attended to as ordered," he said, deliberately vague, careful to protect both protocol and the fragile secret he carried. A candle flickered, sending shadows dancing across the gilded walls, emphasizing the space between them. A space heavy with authority, loyalty, and the weight of potential revelation. The guard's pulse quickened. He could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down, the subtle tension of moral scrutiny waiting to descend like a drawn blade. Camilla's gaze narrowed, perceptive, weighing both words and silence. "And yet," she said slowly, "something seems amiss." Her voice was quiet, almost a murmur, yet the implication was undeniable. The guard maintained composure, but the slightest tightening of his jaw betrayed internal conflict. Every instinct screamed caution, yet conscience urged quiet defiance. He allowed a measured pause before replying, "Your Majesty, all tasks have been fulfilled." His voice was steady, controlled, yet internally. He grappled with the knowledge that obedience had been partial, that one document remained preserved beneath his ceremonial sash. It was a silent rebellion, imperceptible yet monumental. Camilla stepped closer, the grand hall amplifying every movement. Her presence was a force, a reminder that authority here was absolute, yet she was also aware of fragility beneath the surface. "The archives," she said again deliberately, "contain only what you were ordered to preserve." Her tone was measured, yet the question carried a moral weight that transcended protocol. The guard's hand brushed slightly against the letter, hidden yet alive with significance. "Yes, Your Majesty," he replied carefully. Every word was chosen to maintain the balance between obedience and moral preservation. His gaze met hers briefly, unwavering, yet beneath the surface, he felt the surge of tension, the collision of loyalty with conscience. The hall seemed to pulse around them, the chandeliers above refracting light onto marble floors like scattered truths, waiting to be revealed. The camera drifts across the hall, capturing gilded moldings, tall tapestries, and the faint glimmer of a concealed chest beneath a side table. Every detail was meticulously maintained, yet the shadows between them hinted at secrets, at concealed histories, at moral dilemmas lurking in every corner. The atmosphere was charged, not with immediate danger, but with the suffocating tension of unspoken truths. Camilla's voice softened, deceptively gentle, yet threaded with subtle authority. "You understand the consequences of disobedience," she said, stepping closer, candlelight reflecting in her sharp eyes. The guard nodded, outwardly compliant, yet internally aware that his minor act of defiance had already shifted the balance. History, it seemed, could not be erased without consequence. The first confrontation was silent, a duel of presence, perception, and moral intuition. Camilla's awareness of protocol was absolute, yet the hint of discrepancy pricked her mind. A box that had been slightly ajar, a letter that had been preserved, a shadow of hesitation in the guard's otherwise flawless demeanor. Every detail was observed, analyzed, weighed. The guard's internal struggle intensified. Each gesture, each measured breath, was an exercise in precision, balancing loyalty with conscience. He felt the gravity of centuries pressing down, the moral responsibility of what he had preserved. The palace, for all its discipline and hierarchy, now became a stage for the quiet emergence of truth. A distant echo from the far corridor reminded them both of the palace's living presence. Footsteps of attendants, the faint shuffle of robes, the whisper of wind through a half-open window. Every sound reinforced the reality of the confrontation. It was not merely a question of obedience, but a test of moral courage. Camilla's gaze hardened slightly. Loyalty, she said, almost to herself, must be measured against conscience. The words hung in the air like a suspended cord, charged with meaning yet carefully unsaid. The guard's breath slowed, chest tightening, aware that he had stepped into a moral arena far larger than ceremonial obedience or hierarchical expectation. He took a subtle step forward, a gesture both respectful and deliberate, acknowledging the authority in her presence while silently asserting the preservation of truth. Every motion was calibrated, a balance between visibility and concealment, between compliance and defiance. The hall seemed to vibrate with the weight of unspoken history, the pressure of concealed documents, the tension of choices made in shadow. Camilla's hand hovered briefly above a stack of documents at her side, a subtle inquiry rather than accusation. The guard's eyes did not waver. He allowed neither panic nor hesitation to show. And yet, beneath the polished surface of ceremonial precision, a quiet storm brewed. The first breach of protocol, the first whisper of preserved secrets, the first moral assertion against centuries of absolute loyalty. The camera lingers on the gap between them, the glimmer of the hidden letter beneath the guard's sash, the flickering candlelight reflecting on polished marble, and the shadowed corners of the hall where secrets had long been preserved, yet never revealed. Each element is a character, silent but profoundly consequential. Finally, Camilla spoke, deliberately calm but edged with authority. It seems there is more than I anticipated in the archives. The words were light, almost casual, yet they carried the unspoken implication that discovery had occurred, that scrutiny would follow, that moral judgment was imminent. The guard inclined his head, posture unwavering, yet aware that every heartbeat resonated with ethical significance. A faint hush descended over the hall, broken only by the distant tolling of a ceremonial bell. The silence was thick with expectation, with the weight of history, with the tension of confrontation yet unresolved. Every moment, every breath, was charged with possibility, revelation or concealment, obedience or conscience, loyalty or truth. The confrontation has begun, subtle yet profound. The guard now carries the weight of preserved secrets, and the palace itself seems poised to witness a collision between protocol and moral courage. What he does next will ignite forces that neither loyalty nor authority can contain. The guard stood at the center of the grand hall, the hidden letter pressing lightly against his chest, a tangible reminder of choices already made. Candlelight flickered across the polished marble floors, catching the edges of gilded columns, illuminating the quiet tension that hung thick between him and Camilla. Every breath, every slight movement carried significance, yet neither spoke of accusation, yet. Camilla stepped closer, her voice smooth but laced with a quiet edge. "You understand the gravity of disobedience, do you not?" Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, met his. The guard inclined his head, words measured. "I do, Your Majesty. I follow your commands." Yet the truth lay partially hidden beneath the folds of his uniform, where one letter defied the fire. Followed them entirely. Her tone sharpened, not in anger, but in the unrelenting scrutiny of authority. The guard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the internal conflict raging within. All boxes were attended to, he said carefully, except for one. Camilla's expression did not change, though the subtle flicker in her eyes betrayed awareness. She paused, the soft swish of her gown echoing in the hall, her silence almost louder than words. "One," she repeated, slow, deliberate. "A conscious choice, then." "Yes, Your Majesty," he admitted, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. "I preserved it. I believed it contained truths too significant to destroy." The words were simple, yet the hall seemed to vibrate with their weight, as though the stone walls themselves recognized the moral audacity of the act. A sharp silence followed. Camilla stepped back slightly, her hand brushing against a column, the gesture deliberate yet subtle, like a ruler weighing options carefully before striking. "And what truths?" she asked, voice measured, could possibly justify disobedience against centuries of protocol. The guard straightened, gloved hands clasped lightly behind his back. "Truths that history demands, Your Majesty. Facts that, if erased, would alter not only the record of the crown, but the conscience of those who serve it." His words were precise, deliberate, a balance of respect and defiance. Camilla's gaze lingered on him, unyielding. "Do you understand what you risk? The palace does not forgive breaches lightly. Loyalty is tested not in comfort, but in obedience." She paused, the candlelight reflecting across her eyes, sharp as the edge of a blade. "And yet, you chose conscience over protocol. Why?" The guard's eyes did not falter. "Because history is not ours to destroy, and morality cannot be sacrificed for convenience." A soft murmur of wind stirred through the high windows, carrying with it the faint scent of the hearth's fire, the reminder that destruction had already begun elsewhere. "Some truths, Your Majesty, demand preservation, even from the crown." Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, the silence seemed absolute, yet charged with moral scrutiny. Her presence was authority made flesh, ceremonial and unyielding, yet beneath the veneer, a flicker of uncertainty emerged. "And so," she said finally, her voice lower, "you have judged not only the past but the actions of those who commanded it. You have assumed a responsibility that is not yours to bear." The guard bowed his head slightly, acknowledging her point. "Perhaps, Your Majesty, yet I could not obey blindly. Some acts, though commanded, are morally impermissible. To destroy these records would be to erase more than paper. It would erase conscience itself." His words hung in the hall like a suspended cord, resonating against centuries of expectation, of hierarchy, of silence maintained. Camilla's hands rested lightly on the arms of a nearby chair, the gesture deliberate, controlled. "You presume to balance obedience with conscience," she said, almost softly. "Do you understand the weight of that balance? One misstep and both collapse. One revelation and both are undone." The guard lifted his gaze, meeting hers with unwavering resolve. "I do, and yet I cannot ignore what is right for the sake of what is convenient. If loyalty demands erasure of history, then loyalty itself must be questioned." The words were deliberate, slow, measured, but their impact was undeniable. In the Hall of Shadows, moral truth had spoken louder than authority. Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, considering. For a moment, the veneer of control faltered. The guard's defiance was quiet, subtle, yet morally undeniable. He had preserved one letter, not for personal gain, not for malice, but because conscience demanded it. And in doing so, he had challenged centuries of unyielding hierarchy. "You speak as though loyalty and morality can coexist on equal footing," Camilla said finally, her tone low, controlled, yet edged with uncertainty. "Do you not see that one is the foundation of the palace, the other, a perilous intrusion?" The guard straightened further. "I see only that the foundation itself is fragile if built upon silence and erasure. History preserved is loyalty validated, not undermined." He stepped slightly forward, deliberate but not aggressive, the hall amplifying every motion. Candlelight reflected in the gold and marble, painting him as both obedient and defiant simultaneously. Camilla moved toward him, her steps slow, deliberate, commanding without raising her voice. And if this act becomes known, her words were carefully neutral, yet the implication was clear. Revelation could destabilize not just ceremony, but authority itself. The guard's hands remained visible, gloved, steady. Then the truth must be faced, Your Majesty. Better now, with measured discretion, than later, when it cannot be controlled. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of conscience over fear. The silence stretched heavy and deliberate. Outside, shadows shifted as the sun dipped further, elongating the tall windows' reflections across the hall. Every detail, the flicker of candlelight, the polished floor, the gilded moldings, seemed to lean into the moral tension between them. Authority and conscience, loyalty and truth, hovered suspended in the space between two figures. Camilla's lips pressed together, her gaze sweeping the polished marble floor, then returning to the guard. You have preserved what was forbidden, not for self-interest, not for defiance alone, but because you believed in the sanctity of history. That is both admirable and dangerous. She paused, a faint sigh escaping, barely audible above the crackle of the distant fire. Yet it cannot remain hidden forever. The guard inclined his head, accepting her words, understanding the inevitability of scrutiny, yet refusing to relinquish the moral ground he had claimed. I understand, Your Majesty, but to obey blindly would have been betrayal of more than protocol. It would have been betrayal of conscience itself. Camilla's hand brushed the edge of a table near the candles, her fingers resting lightly on the gilded surface. And so the first fracture appears. She murmured almost to herself, protocol, tradition, loyalty, all bending under the weight of truth. Her gaze returned to the guard, sharp yet contemplative. And now we must determine how far this fracture extends. A faint draught stirred the room, shifting the ribbons on the remaining letters, teasing them with movement. The palace itself seemed to lean into the confrontation, alive with the anticipation of revelation. The guard remained poised, calm in posture, but internally aware that his minor act of defiance had already altered the equilibrium of centuries of order. Camilla's voice softened, deliberate, almost conversational, yet heavy with implication. You have shown courage, tempered with conscience. Yet courage in shadow carries risk. Risk not only to yourself, but to the crown, to the palace, and to history. She stepped closer, candlelight glinting across the edges of the letter still hidden beneath his sash. And so, the choice you make next will define the balance between loyalty and morality. The guard's breath was steady. His hands remained visible, his posture disciplined, yet a quiet determination radiated from every movement. He had acted deliberately, knowingly, and the consequences were beginning to crystallize. Loyalty and conscience were no longer separate. They had collided, and the outcome would shape the fate of both authority and truth within the palace walls. The guard leaves the hall with one explosive document in hand, escaping the immediate confrontation. What he discovered within its pages will challenge the crown's authority and reveal truths that could shatter the carefully maintained image of loyalty. The collision between conscience and protocol has only just begun. The palace was quieter than usual, yet the silence carried an intensity that pressed against every polished surface. Candles flickered in high windows, throwing long shadows across marble floors that had borne witness to centuries of order, discipline, and ceremony. Each corridor seemed to hum with memory, as if the stones themselves recalled the choices made in the shadows, the moral compromises that had kept authority intact. Camilla moved slowly through the halls, her steps deliberate yet unhurried. The confrontation with the guard had ended, but its echo lingered like an uninvited presence, pressing against her awareness. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered rumor from the archives had converged into a single, undeniable realization. History had not been as orderly as she had believed. She paused at the threshold of a side chamber, a room seldom visited by attendants. The walls were lined with tall bookshelves, their dark wood polished but heavy with dust, the air rich with the scent of old leather and fading ink. The faint crackle of a dying candle added to the atmosphere, lending the space an almost tangible weight. Here, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, unguarded and solitary. The letter, now preserved in secret, had initiated a chain of events she had not anticipated. The guard had acted with discretion, but his choice had exposed the fragile undercurrent of history she had long managed to keep in equilibrium. Every step she had taken to maintain authority, every decision to preserve reputation over transparency, now appeared in a harsher light. The palace was no longer merely a bastion of ceremony. It was a repository of moral complexity. Camilla lifted a small ledger from a nearby shelf, its leather cover worn and creased with age. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, contained records that had been concealed for decades. Correspondence, alliances, and decisions taken in private. Each entry was precise, almost meticulous, yet beneath the surface lay subtle moral compromises, choices made to protect authority, loyalty, and public perception. The weight of these records pressed on her like a physical burden. As she read, her mind drifted to the decisions she had made herself, the compromises required by her position. Authority demanded discipline, obedience, and often silence, yet history now confronted her with a moral ledger of its own. Each preserved letter, each hidden diary, revealed a pattern of behavior that challenged not only her understanding of loyalty, but the ethical foundation of the palace itself. She paused at a particularly revealing passage, describing an alliance forged in secrecy, one that had influenced succession, policy, and ceremonial precedents. The names had been erased from official record, but the moral implication remained intact, loyalty preserved, yet at the expense of transparency and ethical clarity. Camilla's hands tightened around the edges of the ledger, her mind tracing the lines between power and morality, authority and conscience. Outside the chamber, distant footsteps echoed faintly, a reminder that the palace was alive with movement, even in its quietest hours. Yet within this small, candle-lit space, Camilla felt removed from time itself. The corridors seemed suspended, each shadow a silent witness, each flickering flame a muted confession. The palace had always been a stage, but now she realized it had also been a moral arena, where choices unseen had shaped outcomes, and silence had carried consequences heavier than words. A gentle draught stirred the pages of the ledger, lifting corners as if the palace itself were urging recognition, compelling acknowledgement of truths long concealed. Camilla's gaze traced the faded ink lines, absorbing every detail. Alliances forged for convenience, favors exchanged in shadow, acts undertaken to maintain stability yet fraught with ethical compromise. History was no longer abstract. It was alive, pressing against her awareness, demanding reflection. Her thoughts turned to the guard, whose quiet defiance had illuminated the moral complexity she had long managed to control. His choice, subtle yet decisive, had preserved not only a single letter, but the integrity of conscience itself. Camilla felt the weight of both gratitude and unease, a recognition that order had been challenged, yet in doing so, a deeper ethical balance had been preserved. She allowed herself to linger on one passage, detailing correspondence between advisors long dead. Some instructions had been given in secrecy, their purpose justified in the name of loyalty and stability, yet the moral ambiguity of these acts was unmistakable. Camilla's fingers traced the faint lines of ink, her thoughts oscillating between admiration for the discretion exercised and unease at the implications of concealment. The palace seemed to respond to her contemplation. Shadows shifted subtly across the high ceilings, and the faint creak of floorboards carried as though amplified by history itself. Each sound, each flicker of candlelight, reminded her that authority was inseparable from responsibility, and that moral reckoning, though often deferred, could not be avoided indefinitely. She turned a page, revealing a ledger entry that chronicled an unapproved alliance with a neighboring house, one that had influenced ceremonial decisions and policy implementation. The entry was brief, factual, yet its implications were profound. Actions had been undertaken to preserve power, yet ethical clarity had been compromised. Camilla's pulse quickened slightly, an acknowledgement that the moral weight of leadership was both delicate and relentless. Her mind traced the lineage of decisions, connecting past and present, understanding how the subtle preservation or destruction of information could shape the perception of loyalty, integrity, and authority. Each preserved document now seemed a silent testament to human imperfection. The desire to maintain order, the necessity of discretion, and the ethical consequences of choice. The guard's earlier actions resonated within her awareness. By preserving one letter, he had demonstrated a moral courage that transcended protocol. Camilla's own reflection deepened. Could she have acted differently had she known? The question lingered, unspoken, as shadows stretched across shelves, casting elongated reflections of history onto the marble floor. She opened a drawer, retrieving another bundle of correspondence, their ribbons faded and delicate. Letters chronicled favors exchanged, secret consultations, and decisions taken under duress or ethical ambiguity. Camilla's eyes scanned the text carefully, absorbing not only the content but the moral texture of each choice. Loyalty, she realized, had always been intertwined with compromise. Authority had been maintained, yes, but at the cost of moral clarity. The palace, magnificent and disciplined as ever, seemed suddenly transformed. Corridors she had walked countless times now appeared both familiar and alien, imbued with the resonance of concealed history. Each chamber, each shelf, each ledger page was a silent witness, a custodian of choices made in shadows, and a reminder that moral responsibility was inseparable from power. Camilla paused by a high window, the faint moonlight reflecting across polished floors, and considered the consequences of revelation. The guard's preservation of a single letter had set in motion a chain of reflection, moral reckoning, and inevitable confrontation. She felt the weight of history pressing against her, not as authority but as conscience, forcing acknowledgement of the fragile balance between loyalty and truth. A soft sigh escaped her lips, barely audible above the whisper of the wind through stone corridors. The palace itself seemed to lean into the introspection, its silence thick with moral gravity. Every shadowed corner, every flickering candle, every silent observer, paintings, ledgers, bookshelves, seemed to bear witness to her reflection, to the realization that history, once hidden, demanded recognition. The ledger revealed yet another secret, one more audacious in implication. Correspondence linking ceremonial advisors to a series of morally questionable decisions that had shaped succession, policy, and reputation. The names had been deliberately erased from official record, yet the moral consequences remained undeniable. Camilla's chest tightened. The weight of decision, of moral authority, pressed upon her like the stone walls themselves. Her thoughts returned to the guard. He had acted in shadow, Quietly, deliberately, yet with courage that exceeded mere obedience, Camilla recognized both admiration and unease, admiration for the preservation of conscience, unease at the precedent it established. History, she realized, was no longer a tool to manage or erase. It was a force demanding acknowledgement, and she alone held the responsibility to interpret, to preserve, or to act decisively. The camera drifts along the marble corridors, catching flickers of candlelight across polished floors, the faint shimmer of gilded moldings, and the subtle motion of dust disturbed by wind. The palace itself appears alive, a silent participant in moral reckoning, a repository not merely of authority but of conscience. Each object, each shadow, each faded ink line is a testament to human choice, to the compromises demanded by loyalty, and the inevitability of consequence. Camilla returned to the ledger, flipping through pages with deliberate care. Decisions recorded decades earlier revealed layers of moral compromise, choices undertaken to preserve the crown's stability yet ethically ambiguous. Each entry demanded reflection, actions undertaken in secrecy, motives hidden, and the subtle negotiation between personal conscience and public duty. Even as she catalogued the implications, a quiet awareness settled upon her. The Guard's single act of preservation had illuminated truths she could no longer ignore. The palace, magnificent as it was, had become a repository of moral tension, and the responsibility to reconcile authority with conscience now rested squarely upon her shoulders. A final, irreversible discovery, a ledger detailing scandalous connections and morally ambiguous decisions, forces Camilla to confront both the palace's hidden history and her own legacy. What she uncovers next will compel decisive action, shaping the path toward both reconciliation and revelation. The palace corridors seemed longer at night, each shadow stretching into the next, a silent witness to choices made and secrets preserved. Camilla moved slowly, her steps deliberate yet heavy with the knowledge she now carried. The preserved letter, the ledgers, the diaries, all fragments of truth that had remained hidden for decades, pressed upon her conscience. What had once been routine now felt charged with moral gravity, as if the walls themselves could judge her decisions. She paused at the threshold of the private archive chamber, its tall doors closed yet resonant with possibility. The candlelight flickered softly against polished wood and marble, the shadows seeming to deepen with the weight of anticipation. Camilla's hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying both the gravity of discovery and the restraint she exercised. The palace, silent and imposing, seemed to exhale, a subtle acknowledgement that truth, once glimpsed, could not be undone. Inside, the room smelled of aged parchment, dust, and wax seals long faded with time. Ledgers, maps, and letters were arrayed with careful precision, yet every surface seemed alive with the histories they contained. Camilla lifted the final ledger from the shelf, its leather cracked and softened by decades of handling. She opened it slowly, aware that each page might reveal alliances, betrayals, and moral compromises previously unseen. The first entry was unremarkable at first glance, a simple accounting of correspondence between ceremonial advisors and minor nobles. But the subtle annotations in the margins hinted at clandestine negotiations, favors exchanged under the guise of loyalty, and decisions that had influenced succession without public acknowledgement. Camilla's eyes narrowed as she absorbed the implications. Every line, every carefully preserved detail, carried the weight of unspoken choices and hidden agendas. She turned another page. This one revealed a series of letters documenting unauthorized alliances with external powers, some spanning decades. The decisions recorded here had been made in secrecy, justified by the preservation of stability, yet ethically ambiguous at best. The weight of the knowledge pressed on Camilla like the very stones of the palace, reminding her that authority was inseparable from responsibility, and that secrecy was never without consequence. A faint draft stirred the edges of the ledger, as if the palace itself were urging recognition. Camilla traced the delicate script with her gloved fingers, noting the subtle interplay between protocol and conscience. Decisions had been made to maintain the crown's reputation, but each had come at a cost: trust, morality, and, in some cases, human dignity. Her mind wrestled with the implications, each revelation deepening the moral chasm she now faced. Outside, the distant echo of footsteps reminded her that the palace never truly slept. Every corridor, every archway, every shadowed corner held witnesses. Attendants, guards, even the faint memory of long dead courtiers whose choices still resonated in the archives. Camilla felt the oppressive weight of time itself, as if the palace were holding her accountable, demanding acknowledgement of the truths she now faced. She lifted a bundle of letters tied in faded ribbon, carefully undoing the knots. Each letter chronicled acts taken to preserve power, some bordering on deception or ethical compromise. One, in particular, caught her eye: correspondence documenting a succession decision that had been manipulated to favor stability over fairness. The ink had faded, but the implication was clear. Camilla's chest tightened. The act, though long past, still carried moral resonance. Her mind returned to the guard, whose subtle defiance had preserved a fragment of truth. He had acted without fanfare, quietly, deliberately, yet with courage that transcended protocol. Camilla recognized the depth of his choice. By preserving a single letter, he had forced the palace, and herself to confrontation with its own history. Authority had been challenged, and the moral weight of that challenge now rested squarely on her shoulders. She traced her fingers over another ledger page, detailing actions taken by advisors to conceal alliances, obscure responsibilities, and maintain appearances. Each note, each annotation, was a testament to the careful choreography of loyalty and discretion. Camilla felt both admiration and unease: admiration for the precision of historical preservation, unease for the moral compromises that had allowed authority to endure. The candlelight flickered across her face as she reflected. Authority demanded discipline, obedience, and sometimes silence. Yet history had proven that silence carried consequences far beyond the reach of ceremony. Every preserved letter, every concealed ledger, every diary hidden from public view was a testament to human imperfection. The desire to maintain order, the necessity of discretion, and the ethical consequences of choice. She paused, inhaling the faint scent of aged paper and wax. The palace, magnificent in its discipline, now seemed both familiar and alien. Corridors she had walked countless times now appeared haunted by memory and moral consequence. Every shadow, every flickering candle, every polished surface was imbued with significance. The weight of history pressed upon her, demanding acknowledgement, reflection, and action. Camilla returned to the hidden letter preserved by the guard. Its presence was small, almost inconsequential, yet morally profound. By choosing preservation over destruction, the guard had illuminated the fragility of loyalty unchecked by conscience. Camilla understood that she could no longer regard protocol as sufficient. Moral responsibility demanded intervention. She lifted the letter, examining the delicate script and faded seal. Its contents chronicled decisions that had shaped the palace, influenced succession, and preserved appearances, yet compromised ethical clarity. Camilla's hands trembled slightly as she realized that concealment, even for the sake of authority, had consequences she now had to reckon with. The palace seemed to respond to her reflection. Shadows deepened, candlelight flickered, and the faint hum of memory echoed through corridors long forgotten. Camilla felt the weight of history pressing upon her shoulders, the consequences of past actions converging with the present. Every choice, every preserved secret, every ethical compromise was now hers to confront. She opened the ledger once more, tracing lines that detailed favors, concealed correspondence, and morally ambiguous decisions that had shaped policy and perception for decades. Each revelation added layers to the moral complexity she now faced. Loyalty had been preserved, yes, but at the expense of transparency, fairness, and conscience. Authority, she realized, was inseparable from ethical responsibility. Camilla paused to consider her own role. She had inherited a system built upon silence, discretion, and obedience. Yet the guard's single act of preservation had disrupted the equilibrium, forcing a confrontation with the moral weight of history. Authority without conscience, she realized, was fragile. Power without ethical clarity was unsustainable. The ledger revealed one final entry: correspondence linking ceremonial advisors to a scandal long suppressed. The names had been redacted, the events carefully hidden, yet the implications remained undeniable. Camilla's chest tightened. The palace, for all its discipline and grandeur, was now a repository not just of authority, but of moral consequence. Every shadow, every candlelit corner, every polished floor seemed to bear witness to her reckoning. A faint sigh escaped her lips as she set the ledger aside. The palace itself seemed to exhale, the silence heavy yet alive with expectation. The guard's act of conscience had illuminated truths she could no longer ignore, and now decisive action was inevitable. Authority and morality could no longer coexist in tension. One path would require acknowledgement, intervention, and reconciliation. Camilla lifted her gaze to the high windows, moonlight casting pale reflections across the marble floors. The palace, magnificent yet haunted by history, seemed to watch silently. Every corridor, every chamber, every shadowed corner was alive with consequence. She understood that the path forward demanded courage equal to that of the guard, tempered with prudence, decisiveness, and moral clarity. A final, irreversible discovery, a ledger detailing scandalous connections and morally ambiguous decisions, forces Camilla to act decisively. Her next choices will shape not only the palace's legacy, but the fragile balance between loyalty, conscience, and historical truth. The stage is set for resolution. The morning light seeped into the palace, pale and deliberate, tracing the edges of corridors that had witnessed both history and secrecy. Shadows that had once seemed elongated by concealment now felt balanced, less menacing, yet heavy with anticipation. Camilla moved through these corridors with deliberate calm, each step a measured acknowledgement of the choices she must now confront. The ledger rested on the desk before her, the pages open to reveal a cascade of morally ambiguous decisions, long-concealed alliances, and suppressed correspondences. Camilla's hands, gloved yet steady, hovered over the documents as if their touch alone could reconcile decades of secrecy. She breathed slowly, aware that authority was no longer a shield against conscience. Moral clarity demanded both acknowledgement and action. Footsteps echoed in the distance. The guard entered the room with deliberate caution, each motion disciplined, yet the subtle tension in his shoulders betrayed the emotional weight he carried. He did not speak immediately, allowing silence to fill the space, a respectful acknowledgement that the moment was not for casual words. Camilla looked up, her gaze steady, reflecting both authority and an emerging empathy born of shared moral reckoning. "You have preserved what others would have destroyed," she said finally, her voice measured, neither accusatory nor approving, but heavy with recognition. The guard inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in her words. He had acted quietly, deliberately, preserving conscience over protocol, and now the full implications of his choice were unfolding. Camilla gestured toward the ledger. "The weight of history is not light," she said, "yet in preserving even a single letter, you have forced acknowledgement where there would otherwise have been erasure. That is a courageous act." Her tone softened, the regal formality of authority tempered by reflection. The guard's hands, gloved and steady, remained folded before him, yet his chest rose and fell with quiet relief. She paused, letting the significance of the moment settle. "Loyalty tempered with conscience is rare," she continued, "yet rare or not, it is necessary. History cannot be preserved by authority alone. It requires courage. Yours has ensured that truth will endure." Camilla's eyes lingered on the hidden letter, now exposed between them, a silent testament to moral choice. The guard remained composed, yet a subtle tension persisted, a quiet acknowledgement of the risk he had taken. The palace, silent and imposing, seemed to bear witness, its polished floors and gilded mouldings absorbing the weight of the moral reckoning that had unfolded within these walls. Every shadow, every flickering candle, every high archway seemed to lend gravity to the moment, a reflection of the convergence between authority, conscience, and history. Camilla rose, her movements deliberate, ceremonial. She retrieved a smaller ledger, detailing sensitive correspondence and alliances long suppressed from public record. Each page, carefully preserved, contained decisions that had influenced succession, ceremonial precedents, and policy outcomes. She laid it before the guard not as a threat, but as acknowledgement, the full scope of moral complexity now visible, transparent, and unavoidable. "We cannot undo the past," she said softly, "but we can confront it with clarity and responsibility." Her eyes met his, steady and resolute. "The path forward requires both discretion and integrity. What you have preserved demands careful handling, measured action, and recognition of the fragile balance between loyalty and truth." The guard inclined his head, understanding the gravity of both her words and the responsibility he now shared. Together, they reviewed the contents, moving deliberately through the documents, acknowledging each morally complex decision, each suppressed alliance, each choice that had shaped the palace's public image and private reality. There was no ceremony in their review beyond the weight of acknowledgement itself, the quiet, dignified reckoning that comes from facing history without distortion or denial. Camilla spoke again, her voice steady, reflective, carrying the authority of both position and conscience. "History preserved is not merely for the crown or for protocol. It is for those who will follow, for those who will learn from choices made in shadow. Every act, every decision, every suppressed truth must be acknowledged if we are to preserve integrity." The guard listened, absorbing the moral cadence of her words, aware that their shared recognition was the first step toward reconciliation. The palace seemed to respond, subtly yet perceptibly, to the calm gravity of their actions. Light shifted across gilded surfaces and polished marble floors, shadows softened, and a quiet serenity settled over the high ceilings and tall archways. The corridors, once foreboding, now felt measured, reflective, a space defined by both history and conscience rather than secrecy alone. Camilla's hands rested briefly on the ledger, her gloved fingers tracing the edges of faded ink and brittle pages. She exhaled slowly, allowing the weight of moral responsibility to settle evenly across her shoulders. The guard, standing nearby, mirrored her composure, their shared acknowledgement a silent pact. Loyalty and conscience could coexist, but only when history was preserved and confronted without avoidance. "Some truths," she said quietly, "cannot be ignored, no matter how inconvenient they may seem. Preservation is not defiance, it is acknowledgement. Courage tempered by conscience ensures that the past informs the present and shapes the future responsibly." The guard nodded, understanding the subtle but profound distinction. His choice had been an act of courage, not rebellion, guided by conscience rather than defiance. Camilla retrieved a sealed envelope, carefully preserved, one of the most sensitive pieces of correspondence from the ledgers. She handed it to the guard. "This," she said, "must be handled with discretion, yet acknowledged fully. It is the bridge between authority and conscience, history and action. You will ensure it is preserved for reflection and accountability, not destruction." The guard's hands accepted the envelope reverently, aware of its significance and the moral weight it carried. A quiet moment passed between them, unspoken yet fully understood. The palace, a silent witness to centuries of protocol and secrecy, seemed to settle in acknowledgement. The confrontation had ended, replaced by a measured collaboration defined not by hierarchy alone, but by shared responsibility and ethical clarity. Camilla stepped back, surveying the space, her eyes resting on the high windows where morning light now fully illuminated the hall. Shadows were no longer threatening. They simply traced the contours of history, of choice, of consequence. Order and conscience need not be opposed, she said, voice calm, reflective. When balanced, they preserve both authority and truth. That balance, fragile as it may be, is what we must protect. The guard inclined his head, understanding that their shared acknowledgement was not merely about the documents, the ledgers, or the letter. It was about the principles they represented. Loyalty aligned with conscience, history preserved without distortion, authority tempered by moral clarity. The palace, magnificent yet morally complex, now reflected their reconciliation. Outside, the faint murmur of palace life continued, but within the high, ceilinged chamber, time seemed suspended. Candles flickered gently, dust drifted in golden shafts of light, and the quiet resonance of moral acknowledgement lingered in the air. The reconciliation of duty, loyalty, and conscience had begun, fragile yet enduring, a testament to both courage and integrity. The stage is set for final closure. Camilla and the guard have reconciled authority with conscience, yet the palace's history, carefully preserved, still demands measured reflection. What remains is not conflict, but dignified acknowledgement, laying the foundation for restoration and subtle forgiveness. The palace breathed quietly in the hours before dusk, its corridors bathed in amber light, shadows softened against polished marble floors. The weight of past secrets still lingered, yet the hallways now held a sense of calm, a fragile equilibrium achieved through acknowledgement rather than concealment. Camilla walked deliberately through these corridors, her steps measured, the soft echo of her gown a rhythm against the centuries of authority contained within these walls. The guard followed at a careful distance, a subtle acknowledgement of both hierarchy and shared responsibility. Neither spoke immediately, allowing the silence to articulate the gravity of the moment. In the stillness, the palace itself seemed alive, absorbing the reconciliation of conscience and protocol, the delicate balance between duty and moral courage. Camilla entered the private archive chamber once more, where the ledgers, letters, and preserved documents were carefully arranged. The space felt lighter now, the shadows of secrecy replaced with the quiet dignity of transparency. Candlelight reflected softly across gilded moldings and polished floors, a muted celebration of restored moral order. She gestured toward the ledgers, her voice steady, measured. The records preserved here are not merely history, they are testimony. They speak of decisions made, mistakes concealed, and courage exercised in silence. They are now acknowledged, not destroyed, and that acknowledgement ensures both integrity and accountability. The guard stepped closer, accepting her words with solemn understanding. He had acted quietly, preserving a single letter that had sparked this chain of reflection and reconciliation. Authority had been challenged subtly, yet with purpose. Conscience had prevailed without rebellion, and the palace now reflected that careful balance. Camilla selected one of the documents, the most sensitive of all, and placed it on a ceremonial table. Its seal was unbroken, its contents preserved with deliberate care. "This," she said softly, "must remain intact, not as a threat, nor as defiance, but as acknowledgement of truth. History preserved in this form ensures both the dignity of the crown and the integrity of conscience." The guard inclined his head, reverent yet composed. "It will be protected, Your Majesty, preserved, not destroyed, as you command." His hands hovered momentarily over the document, understanding the weight of responsibility and the subtle trust placed upon him. In this small gesture, the balance between authority and conscience was made tangible. Camilla's gaze swept the room, noting the meticulous arrangement of documents, ledgers, and letters. Every object now held dual significance, evidence of past authority and a record of moral consideration. The palace, once a repository of concealment, now bore witness to careful preservation and dignified acknowledgement. She spoke again, her tone soft but deliberate. "There will be no public scandal, no accusation, yet the moral clarity gained here must guide every future decision. Authority alone is insufficient. Conscience must temper every command, every choice, every ceremonial action." The guard nodded, absorbing her words. He understood that preservation was now inseparable from execution, that discretion was an instrument of moral duty as much as obedience. The palace itself seemed to settle around them, acknowledging the quiet reconciliation of protocol and conscience. Camilla opened another ledger, revealing correspondence that had been long suppressed. She traced the lines of faded ink with deliberate care, noting the decisions that had influenced policy, succession, and ceremonial precedents. Each annotation, each carefully preserved note, was now acknowledged not with accusation, but with understanding. History, she realized, was preserved through recognition, not erasure. A soft murmur of movement in the corridor reminded them of the palace's continuing life. Attendants moved with ceremonial precision, their footsteps echoing across the marble floors, yet the air now carried a subtle serenity. Shadows were no longer menacing. They merely traced the contours of history, of decisions made, of conscience exercised. Camilla looked toward the guard. "You have acted with courage tempered by judgment. That courage has preserved both history and integrity. For that, you are recognized, not merely as a servant of protocol, but as a steward of truth." Her words were dignified, measured, and full of quiet acknowledgement. The guard inclined his head, a small, solemn gesture. "I serve the crown, Your Majesty, yet I preserved conscience alongside duty. That balance is now restored." The palace itself seemed to resonate with the affirmation, the polished surfaces and gilded moldings reflecting the reconciliation achieved within these walls. Camilla took a final, deliberate step toward the ledger and the preserved letter. Candlelight danced across the pages, illuminating both ink and moral significance. "History," she said softly, "must never be feared. It must be acknowledged. Every preserved truth ensures that the crown's authority is exercised with integrity, that loyalty is meaningful, and that conscience remains unbroken." A faint draught stirred the room, carrying the subtle scent of wax, leather, and aged parchment. Shadows shifted gently along the walls, tracing the contours of ledgers, letters, and ceremonial objects. Camilla allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, acknowledging the gravity of her position, the responsibility borne by those who preserve authority, and the fragile but enduring significance of conscience in guiding the crown. The guard placed the sealed letter gently within a secure compartment of the archival cabinet. Its preservation was now ceremonial, dignified, and deliberate. Every gesture reflected the moral balance achieved, authority tempered by conscience, protocol aligned with integrity. The palace itself seemed to exhale, settling into the quiet dignity of restored equilibrium. Camilla moved toward the high windows, moonlight now softening into early evening light. She looked across the marble floors, the gilded moldings, and the arranged ledgers, seeing the palace not merely as a repository of history, but as a living testament to the reconciliation of authority, loyalty, and morality. "Order is restored," she murmured, not through erasure, not through denial, but through acknowledgement. Loyalty and conscience are no longer opposed. They coexist, delicate yet enduring, guiding every choice we make. Her words hung in the room, resonant with both authority and reflection, a quiet conclusion to a long moral reckoning. The guard stepped beside her, their shared understanding unspoken yet profound. The palace, magnificent and disciplined, now reflected the careful balance of history preserved, conscience exercised, and authority exercised responsibly. Shadows, candlelight, and polished surfaces all bore silent witness to the reconciliation achieved through courage, judgment, and acknowledgement. Camilla's final act was subtle. She traced the edges of the preserved letter one last time, acknowledging the moral courage of the guard, the weight of history, and the responsibility she now carried. The palace, in its grandeur, seemed to bow in quiet recognition, the balance restored, the legacy preserved, and the conscience honored. The palace breathes a cautious sigh. Camilla gazes over the archives, contemplating the fragility of memory and the responsibility of silence. Though the immediate crisis has passed, the lessons of conscience and courage will linger, quietly shaping all who serve within these walls. The palace had settled into a rare stillness. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting pale, deliberate shafts across polished marble floors. Dust motes danced in the warm illumination, drifting lazily over gilded moldings and the surfaces of carefully preserved ledgers. In the quiet, even the grandest chambers felt intimate, alive with memory and reflection. Camilla walked slowly, deliberately through the corridors, her hands clasped behind her back. Each step was measured, almost ceremonial, yet lighter than before. The confrontation, the moral reckoning, and the reconciliation had passed, leaving in their wake a fragile serenity. The palace no longer felt like a repository of secrecy and hierarchy alone. It had become a sanctuary of conscience and remembrance. She paused in the central gallery, where portraits of ancestors watched silently from gilded frames. Each painted gaze seemed both commanding and contemplative, as though history itself observed the reconciliation of authority and morality. Camilla's fingers traced the edge of a marble balustrade. Here, in the quiet interplay of light and shadow, she felt the weight of choice, the courage required to act morally within the confines of duty, the delicate balance between obedience and conscience. The guard entered the gallery behind her, moving with the same quiet reverence. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Their shared understanding resonated in the subtle alignment of movement, the tacit acknowledgement that courage had preserved history and conscience had guided action. They walked side by side, silent, observing the palace as it absorbed the outcome of events that had once threatened to fracture its carefully maintained order. Camilla's gaze fell upon a small, sealed letter resting in the corner of a display case. The guard had preserved it with care. The crown had now formally acknowledged its significance. The letter, fragile and yellowed with age, symbolized more than hidden correspondence. It was a testament to moral courage, an emblem of the choice to protect truth over convenience. conscience over blind obedience. She lifted the letter briefly, feeling its texture between gloved fingers. The ink had faded, but the message remained intact, a delicate yet undeniable link to history, integrity, and duty. Even the smallest act of preservation can ripple through centuries, she murmured. The guard inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of her words. Their silence carried the weight of understanding. History, conscience, and authority were inseparable, intertwined by the choices made in moments of moral reckoning. The light shifted across the gallery as the sun descended, gilded frames glowing warmly in the fading illumination. Camilla allowed herself to pause, reflecting on the delicate interplay between the palace's grandeur and its moral responsibilities. Every corridor, every archway, every preserved document told a story not merely of authority maintained, but of conscience exercised, courage preserved, and truth acknowledged. She moved toward a window overlooking the courtyard, where stone paths curved gracefully around trimmed gardens. The palace breathed in quiet dignity, each shadow, each column, each reflecting surface harmonizing with the serene rhythm of the late afternoon. In this calm, Camilla understood that preservation of history was not merely administrative, it was ethical, spiritual, and profoundly human. The guard stood a respectful distance away, observing her reflection in the marble floors. In his posture there was no pride, no triumph, only the quiet acknowledgement of duty fulfilled, conscience preserved, and moral courage recognized. The palace itself seemed to exhale, the weight of secrets lifted, yet the lessons of conscience lingering like subtle echoes through the corridors. Camilla's eyes returned to the sealed letter, to the ledgers, to the carefully preserved archives. Each artifact, each document, each ribboned bundle carried symbolism beyond the words inscribed within. They represented the delicate intersection of duty and morality, authority and discretion, loyalty and conscience. In the quiet of the palace, she felt the invisible threads of responsibility connecting generations, bridging past and present, guiding future choices. She allowed her gaze to linger on the subtle details, the faint flicker of candlelight against polished surfaces, the dust suspended in the sunlight, the gentle curve of carved wood in the gallery. These seemingly minor details became profound reminders that even in grandeur, even amidst authority, history, and moral responsibility, was preserved not through spectacle, but through subtle, deliberate acts of conscience. The guard moved closer, his presence steady but unobtrusive. "The palace feels different now," he said quietly. His voice was calm, reflective, carrying the resonance of shared understanding, not lighter, not diminished, but balanced. The weight of conscience is visible alongside authority. Camilla nodded, allowing a small, reflective smile. "Balance," she said softly, "is what sustains both history and integrity. The choices we preserve, the truths we honor, shape not only the palace, but the conscience of those who serve within it. Even silence has meaning when it is deliberate and guided by responsibility." They walked together toward the central chamber, where the largest ledgers were kept, now arranged ceremonially, each page meticulously catalogued and preserved. The room carried an almost sacred weight. Its quiet dignity emphasized the moral gravity of their actions. Here, the past was neither erased nor ignored, and the palace itself became a living testament to the ethical choices that had guided authority through centuries. Camilla lifted a ledger and turned its pages slowly, carefully, reverently. She allowed herself to read annotations she had not yet considered, understanding not only the decisions recorded, but the moral intent behind each one. Each choice, each compromise, each act of discretion reflected the interplay of conscience and authority, loyalty and moral courage. The palace was now a space where history was honored, truth preserved, and authority tempered by conscience. A faint wind stirred through the high windows, lifting dust motes in quiet motion. Camilla closed the ledger and allowed the moment to settle. Light softened as evening approached, shadows lengthening but no longer menacing. The palace, magnificent in structure and history, now carried the quiet dignity of reconciliation. Moral courage, once isolated in a single preserved letter, now resonated through every corridor, every archive, every polished surface. The guard stood silently, acknowledging the subtle power of reflection. No words were necessary. Their shared understanding was profound, a quiet acknowledgement that authority and conscience, history and integrity could coexist when guided by deliberate, courageous choices. The palace itself seemed to breathe in this equilibrium, its walls, corridors and chambers imbued with the weight of legacy and the clarity of ethical acknowledgement. Camilla finally turned toward the door, glancing back at the ledgers and letters, the preserved documents and careful arrangements. Even when hidden, even when suppressed, truth endures, she said softly. It survives in conscience, in preservation, and in the courage to act deliberately. The guard inclined his head, understanding not only the immediate moral resolution but the enduring lesson. The palace, history, and conscience were inseparable. Every act of preservation, every acknowledgement of truth, carried significance far beyond the immediate, rippling into the conscience of generations to come. The palace, bathed in the soft glow of fading light, holds its stories, its lessons, and its preserved truths. What other secrets lie buried beneath the velvet corridors of power? Even as calm settles, the echoes of courage, conscience, and history linger, silently shaping all who serve within these walls. The palace had grown quieter still. Evening, light softened through high windows, pooling in delicate patterns across polished floors. Dust motes floated in the golden shafts, each particle catching the fading sun like fragments of memory suspended in time. Camilla and the guard moved slowly through the central hall, their footsteps measured, in rhythm with the palace itself, a silent observer of history, duty, and moral consequence. Camilla paused by a long, narrow display case, the preserved ledgers and letters within catching the last light of day. She traced her gloved fingers along the polished edge, thoughtful, contemplative. Each document was a silent witness, a repository not merely of events, but of choices made, compromises preserved, and conscience exercised. Here, history breathed, and within its quiet exhalation lay lessons unspoken yet profound. The palace holds its own memory, she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the expansive space. Every document, every preserved letter, they are not just records, they are reminders that conscience, even when quiet, is never absent. Even in silence it speaks. The guard stood beside her, hands folded in respectful observation. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the weight of the moment, the convergence of authority, history, and moral clarity, to resonate fully. The palace itself seemed to affirm their shared understanding, that courage and conscience, when carefully exercised, could coexist alongside loyalty and duty. Camilla moved toward a window overlooking the courtyard, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The stone paths, trimmed gardens, and reflecting pools held a quiet symmetry, mirroring the equilibrium achieved within the palace walls. Shadows stretched, gentle and elongated, yet no longer oppressive. Here, reflection and reconciliation existed side by side, delicate yet enduring. She turned back to the guard. History preserved is not merely for remembrance, it is for guidance. Those who serve must understand that the past shapes conscience, informs decisions, and tempers authority. What we honor today ensures integrity for tomorrow. The guard inclined his head, his posture conveying both humility and recognition. The single letter he had preserved, once a potential spark of defiance, now represented moral courage crystallized into enduring principle. The palace, magnificent yet morally resonant, seemed to pulse with that quiet truth. Authority guided by conscience is far more lasting than obedience alone. Camilla moved deeper into the chamber, toward a small alcove where ancient ledgers rested alongside ceremonial objects. Each item carried symbolic weight. A ribboned bundle of correspondence, a carefully preserved seal, a ledger whose pages chronicled decades of decisions both public and concealed. She lifted one of the ledgers, turning its pages slowly, deliberately. Each line, each annotation, reflected a moral narrative written in ink. Choices balanced, discretion exercised, and courage quietly applied. She allowed herself a moment of stillness, absorbing the lessons the palace itself seemed to offer. Authority, she understood, was not a static construct. It was alive, mutable, and inseparable from the moral compass of those who wielded it. Every corridor, every shadow, every flickering candle offered subtle guidance, quietly reminding those within these walls that conscience must accompany duty. The guard observed her reflection in the polished marble floors, understanding that preservation was not merely a function of obedience. It was a sacred responsibility. The palace's history, carefully catalogued and preserved, now bore the imprint of moral courage, echoing silently through corridors and chambers. Even objects untouched by human hand carried resonance. Dust, light, shadows, and stone whispered of accountability, integrity, and choice. Camilla replaced the ledger gently, as one might lay down a fragile relic of human responsibility. The act itself was symbolic, a recognition that the preservation of conscience, though delicate, was essential. The palace, magnificent in structure and history, had become a living testament not only to authority, but to the enduring necessity of moral courage. She moved toward the high windows once more, looking out at the quiet courtyard. The reflecting pools mirrored the fading light, and the carefully trimmed hedges traced deliberate patterns, echoing the order within the palace itself. In this mirrored symmetry, Camilla saw the delicate balance between authority and conscience, history and choice, duty and moral courage. Each element, though static, seemed alive with meaning. The smallest preserved truth can guide generations. She murmured, almost to herself. A single act of conscience, quietly maintained, ensures that authority is meaningful, that loyalty is tempered by integrity, and that history is preserved without distortion. The guard stepped closer, his presence unobtrusive, yet his attentiveness a subtle acknowledgement of shared responsibility. The palace, he said softly, no longer feels like a repository of secrets. It feels alive, conscious in a way. Each shadow, each document, it speaks. Camilla nodded, her gaze sweeping the gallery and corridors. It speaks not in words, but in preservation, in acknowledgement, in the courage to act rightly when choices are hidden from view. What we leave behind in silence carries as much weight as what is spoken aloud. The palace, bathed now in deep twilight, seemed to settle into reflection. Candles flickered gently in wall sconces. Shadows danced across gilded surfaces, and the weight of centuries pressed softly yet undeniably. In this stillness, the lessons of history and moral courage converged. Authority and conscience, preservation and acknowledgement, loyalty and integrity, all intertwined, inseparable, and enduring. Camilla paused in the central hall, her hands folded before her. The guard remained a step behind, observing silently. Every corridor, every archway, every polished surface carried resonance, a quiet affirmation that the palace's history had been reconciled not through destruction or concealment, but through deliberate acknowledgement and courage. She allowed herself a final reflection, gentle but deliberate. Even in silence, even when unseen, courage matters, conscience matters, history matters. The choices preserved here are not merely for today. They ripple forward, shaping every act, every decision, every conscience that walks these halls in the future. The guard inclined his head once more, understanding that the palace, the ledgers, the letters, and the preserved artifacts were not merely symbols. They were living reminders of what had been preserved and why. Authority and conscience, once in tension, now resonated in harmony, guiding every future act within these walls. Camilla turned toward the exit, the fading light casting long, graceful shadows. She paused, glancing back at the ledgers, letters, and ceremonial objects that now bore the imprint of moral courage. "The palace remembers," she said softly, "and we, who serve within it, must ensure that memory guides us wisely." A gentle breeze stirred through the high windows, lifting faint dust motes and carrying a subtle scent of wax, leather, and aged parchment. The palace seemed to exhale, carrying with it the weight of conscience acknowledged, authority exercised responsibly, and history preserved. The echoes of courage and moral clarity lingered, subtle yet enduring. The palace falls into quiet reflection, its corridors alive with memory and preserved truths. Even as calm settles, the lessons of conscience, courage, and historical preservation resonate, leaving an enduring question: what other secrets lie quietly beneath the velvet halls, waiting to guide the consciences of those who follow?